I've got their names all listed on the back of this thing. But the only one that I know for sure didn't survive the war was Maisel. And he'd gone home on a 75-day leave,
Mm-hmm.
and he came back and he got killed on his first mission back.
Oh, man.
And which validated my command. I see it, the commanding officer, Gordon Fowler. I told my grandson, who just got out of the military as an officer, and I said, your experience is so different. In wartime, there was no salute. We didn't wear insignia. Everybody was last name King, so forth. Because you're all a band of brothers. You didn't have the
Right.
So now we didn't salute. No one saluted me. I didn't salute anybody the whole time I was flying over there.
What's your full name?
Wallace Noel King.
And what's your birth date?
October 31st, 1923.
And where were you born?
In Cortland, Ohio, at home, which the children were mostly born at home by midwives at that time.
Yeah. I know my mom was. I assume my dad may have been too. I'm not sure. What's Cortland close to?
Warren, just about 9 miles north of Warren, Ohio, which is a county seat of Trumbull County.
Okay. And were you raised there? What did your parents do? And
well, my dad came from a farming family. His dad and mother had 2 farms in Mecca Township, about 6 miles north of the little village of Cortland. And he had 5 brothers, so and 2 sisters, and so he was raised in a farming community and worked as a farmer.
yeah.
But when he became 21, I think he and his dad probably had a little disagreement because he moved in Cortland in the village and never worked in agriculture after that.
And what about you, siblings?
I have 2 older half brothers. My father's first wife, I believe, died in the flu epidemic of 1918-19. At least she died in that period, and also lost a child, and left 3 other children, young children, to my dad to raise. And he hired my mother as a person to help him raise the children, and after a year or so he married her. So I guess he figured it was cheaper to marry her than to pay her her salary.
And so you grew up on a farm? Or?
No, we lived in a village in a normal, there were only 500 people in the village. And so it was a walk to school, which was 2 blocks away, all 12 years of education, and which is unusual today to go to the same building for 12 years.
I know. I never did. And so let me ask you this early on, and then what did you do and what branch of the service, and what unit were you with?
Well, I enlisted to fly, and shortly after the regulations were changed for pilot training from 2 years of college and 21 to high school education in 18. So my 18th birthday was in 1941. The year I graduated from high school in October. So the following year, in 1942, sometime in that time period, they changed the requirements, and my my childhood friend for the first 5 years of school enlisted because he was a year and a half older. He was a year ahead of me in school, and he enlisted when he became 18. and I was a year and a half behind him, so I didn't enlist quite as fast as he did. So, and then I went through pilot training in Air Corps and graduated in March of 1944 in Class 44C at Eagle Pass, Texas, a single engine advanced. And, then went to Tallahassee, Florida for fighter transition in P-40s Warhawks, and then overseas on the Aquitania to Scotland, and eventually I was introduced to the P-51 Mustang in England, and got about 15 to 20 hours of solo Mustang. Every hour was solo because you didn't have any dual instruction. And then went over to the A1, the first airstrip in France, in late July, early August, after D-Day. So then I was assigned initially at the Mustang unit, the 363rd Fighter Group, and the reason I didn't fly any missions with them, shortly after I got there, they deactivated the group because they had lost all their leadership, and they just didn't have any experienced pilots to train us replacements in flying combat. So that I was transferred into P-47s, went down to Le Mans, where the 406 Fighter Group was operating at the time.
Okay.
And I flew I was assigned to 513th Fighter Squadron, one of the three of the 406 Fighter Group.
That's a lot to remember.
Yeah.
Well, that's something new I didn't know about you, that you started with the, well, I assumed the P-40 probably, but not the P-51.
No, the P-40 was antiquated. It wasn't even capable of competing in World War II. It had a carbureted engine, and it had a service ceiling of maybe 18,000 feet or less.
Oh, really?
And of course, you'd have to have oxygen at that point.
Yeah.
Good old sturdy airplane. In fact, it was almost as sturdy as the P-47, but the 51 was a wildcat compared to the P-40 and the P-47.
Which did you prefer?
Well, it was a benefit to transfer to P-47s because the P-47 is much better suited to ground support work than the P-51. It doesn't have the vulnerabilities of the P-51. P-51 was designed to be a high-altitude escort fighter, whereas the P-47 was designed much earlier, went through a long, gradual transition, and so it was really the only war-ready plane that the Air Force had, in Air Corps at that time had when the war started. It was it had a service ceiling of well over 20,000 feet. It was turbocharged. It had no fuel in the wings, which made it less vulnerable. It had an air-cooled engine rather than liquid-cooled engine, which was less vulnerable to damage. And it had a conventional wing rather than a laminar flow wing that the 51 had, which gave the 51 some quirky characteristics. So the 47 was much beefier. It weighed probably twice as much as a P-51, but it was really an easier plane to fly.
Really?
It was. They're
huge. Yeah.
In fact, I went down to Le Mans, and an operations officer came out and sent me in a cockpit the next day, and we went through a cockpit check. He says, "Take it around." And so I did, made one landing, and next day I flew my first mission, first combat mission. And of course, it was good that it was an easy airplane to fly, because a first combat mission, that's what it's just all about. So, but it was a much beefier airplane. It could sustain a lot more damage and bring you home than the 51 could.
That's some really good information that I'd never really heard from anybody directly.
Well, the 50, I don't know how much of this you want to edit out of there, but the 51 had a nasty characteristic. It would snap roll like that. In fact, I have a good friend that still survives. He's 100 years old. On Valentine's Day, and he flew 51s in the 8th Air Force doing escort duty and weather reconnaissance flights. And he said he told me if he ever killed himself, he'd be on an approach coming back from a long mission because you get careless, you're relaxed, and you're not paying attention. It's an airplane you don't slow under 150 miles an hour. It's not. The controls get sloppy. And now I got accustomed to it. Once I realized this, it wasn't any problem. Because it did give you pretty good feedback. But he actually snap rolled on approach on an instrument landing, coming back from a mission, and he recovered. His wingman saw him and says, "Well, he's dead." He came back. He went on to another field because the weather was bad and landed after he recovered from the snap roll. And he came back the next day, and they had all his personal effects in a footlocker ready to send to the warehouse.
Oh my goodness.
He was dead as far as the group was concerned. They didn't think he could recover from a snap roll that low to the ground.
What's the cause of that? It was just the
well, it could be the design.
engine.
It was rushed into like a lot of things, like the B-29. We had all kinds of development problems because it was rushed into production. It was designed for a specific purpose. The P-47 was not as maneuverable at altitude as the P-51. The 51 was a better air-to-air. It was more maneuverable, and so it just didn't. Just an example of some of the problems. To give it the range, they were retrofitted with fuel tanks behind the pilot for 30 or 40 or 50 gallons. And you had to use that first because you could not engage any tight turns with that weight back there. And it bothers me that they still flying these 51s around the country with a jump seat behind the pilot. So they're restoring the inherent instability by putting that weight behind the pilot again.
Okay.
In fact, my friend, buddy that would not ride in one, he was offered to ride in one, and he said, "I'm not going to ride in that. It's unstable with that weight back there."
Wow.
Now,
and I've been dreaming of doing that.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't long after he'd refused to take the ride in one that a 51 crashed somewhere in Nashville, I think, killed both the passenger and the... And it just probably snap rolled on him and wasn't careful. But it wasn't experienced enough to realize that when those controls got sloppy, you had to be very, very careful. It was not a thing that's very critical. I think once you get some experience in 51, you know what to do. Just even like my friend, he could recover from snap roll at very low altitude, but you had to be really a proficient pilot to do that.
I understand. Wow. Okay. Why were you interested in flying?
Well, I'd always been interested in flying. As a young boy growing up, Smiling Jack was a cartoon in a local paper. And Smiling Jack was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. And that's what it was about, was experience flying airplanes. And I built models with balsa and tissue paper and that type of thing with a rubber band motor on a propeller. I built numerous ones of those, spent a day building one or more, and then I'd crash it the next couple of stages. Go out and fly it and it would crash. So I was always interested in flying, and I think my attitude was when I graduated from high school, even though Pearl Harbor had not happened yet, my classmates, we all knew that we were going to be in service. The war was coming, it was inevitable, and so we knew that was ahead of us. And so when the opportunity offered itself to apply for pilot training, I did. Got accepted, and
Very smart.
And it was very competitive. There were about 100 of us who had applied for pilot training. You had to go to Cleveland to enroll in pilot training. You couldn't do it in Youngstown or Warren, Ohio. And there were we got called up then to take the mental exam. So there were about 100 in the room. A week later, I got the notice that I'd passed the mental test. I had to report back shortly thereafter for the physical test.
Yeah.
There were about 50 reported back. Now, whether they were the 50 from the same 100, I don't know, but there were about 50 anyway, which was an all-day affair. And the first test they gave you was color blindness. Open this book with these dots, and you had to see the numbers in the dots.
Yeah.
You're probably familiar with a colorblind test. And it's amazing, that eliminated about 15 of the 50 right there.
Wow.
No,
That's a lot.
Color blindness is much more common than we think. And
I may be colorblind and never knew it.
that's right. You're exactly right. Unless you take a test, you don't know it. I know my neighbor across the street enrolled for pilot training in the Navy in Vietnam War era. And at first, he flunked the colorblind test, and that was the end of his career. He ended up in the Marines, but in submarines, working with submarines. So that eliminated them. Then the next test we got was a depth perception test, where you have to align the two little things in a box about 25 feet in front of you. And that eliminated another one. Anyway, there were about 25 that passed it out of the 50, about half that got approved for pilot training. So I had no idea it was that competitive. So
Yeah, those are just a couple of the first tests, and then
when I got to pre-flight school in San Antonio, Texas, eventually, we were first early in our experience. The fellow said, "Look to your left, look to your right. Only one of you three is going to become a pilot." Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But there was a lot of attrition, especially in primary flying school, the first flying.
yeah,
And that school is if you didn't solo in less than 10 hours of dual instruction, if you reached 10 hours and hadn't soloed, you were probably going to get washed out.
wow.
And that eliminated, I would say, a good third of the class in primary school. After that, they had an investment in you, so they were a lot more tolerant. They gave you a little more leeway when you got to basic flying school and advanced flying school. Rarely did they wash anyone out of advanced flying school. You might have to go back and repeat it, but they weren't going to wash. They had too much invested in you to wash out and start over.
Yeah. Gosh. So you had graduated high school, of course, and then enlisted afterwards or later that year, right? So kind of walk me through where you started training a little bit, and then you sort of mentioned it earlier, just
Well, the
quickly.
interesting thing was I was sworn in that day that I passed the physical
Okay.
as a private in the U.S. Army. So I'm on inactive status and sent home. So I was actually in my military experience began in October of 1942. And so I was at home, and my buddy, who was my childhood friend, he didn't enroll earlier. He'd been at home for 4 or 5 months. Before that, he was at home. The Air Corps had all these future trainees in their back pocket, and the other branches got apprehensive about. They wanted men. Air Corps had these prime young 17, 18-year-olds. So the Army Air Corps come up with the plan to isolate them. So they come up with a arrangement where they'd give 4 weeks of regular Army basic training to these people who are sitting around doing nothing. So in January 1943, they called all these reservists into active duty. They did it in 2 stages. I was in the first stage in early January, sent to Kaiser Field in Alabama, and given 4 weeks of drill training, just like I don't think it was as maybe as rugged as the infantry would, but marching and physical enhancement and so forth.
Yeah.
And then they built these temporary shacks on existing Army air bases. And so to get the second half of these reserves, we had to get rid of us, so they come up with a college training detachment where you go to college for 6 months. And they contracted with colleges all over the United States to set up these programs. They were done in a hurry. I went to Shreveport, Louisiana, to Centenary College, supposedly for 6 months of this. We were called aviation students. Mm-hmm. Technically, we were still privates in the U.S. Army, but as the training fields were built and staffed and ready, they started drawing them out of the college training detachments to begin to go to classification and pre-flight. So I was in the first group to leave Centenary College after probably 6 weeks there. We got up there about the 1st of March, and I left by the end of April. I was gone by the end of April. Went to San Antonio, which was a Lackland Air Force Base. Now is what it was called, San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center at that time. Then you went to classification, which they supposedly determined whether you're going to be trained as a pilot, a bombardier, or a navigator. Mm-hmm. And I think that must have been a lot of window dressing, because I think almost everyone I knew was classified for pilot training. And then you went across the main road through San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center to the pre-flight school. So you just moved from one side of the base to the other. And the pre-flight school started the formal training of the 3 pilot training sessions, each 9.5 weeks. Why 9.5 weeks? I don't know, but it was 9.5 weeks of pre-flight, 9.5 weeks of primary training, 9.5 weeks of basic flying training, and 9.5 weeks of advanced flying training. And so I was sent to Chickasha, Oklahoma for primary flight training after pre-flight school. And and then I went to Coffeyville, Kansas for basic flying school, the second phase, and Eagle Pass, Texas, which is in the news now because of the border crossings. You see Eagle Pass, Texas every night in the nightly news. Which Eagle Pass, Texas was just those cow town. Then it's much bigger now for advanced. And it was interesting, at the end of basic flying school at Coffeyville, Kansas, and each of these we got about 65 hours of flight training. Yeah. You had the opportunity to request either going to multi-engine advanced or single-engine advanced. And I just selected to go to multi-engine advanced. I wanted to fly the bigger airplanes. I got assigned to single-engine advanced. My instructor, who coincidentally, very unusual, had been in a neighboring high school district to me when I graduated from high school. He had been a few classes ahead of me. He was a good basketball player, and I remember seeing him play basketball when I was in high school. But Bob Alexander was the instructor, and I said to him one day, I said, "Well, you see, I see I didn't get my first choice of advanced training." He said, "Wally, you're too good a pilot to fly those big boxes," he says.
Oh, really?
And so anyway, I went to Eagle Pass, Texas for single engine advanced, and then after, that's where I got my wings and commissioned an officer, second lieutenant, and then to Tallahassee, Florida to get fighter transition in P-40s for probably another 100 hours, I suppose. And then on the ship to England as a replacement pilot. And that's really what their classes of 44A, B, and C. They were every 9.5 weeks there was a new class graduating. Actually, less than that. It was because there were 2 classes at every school, upper class and lower class. So maybe every month there was another. Yeah, every month there was another class graduating. Mm-hmm. And so went over across on the Aquitania, the sister ship, the Lusitania,
Okay.
which it had been in commercial service in the Pacific when the war broke out, and so they converted to troop ship. And I was traveling on, all replacement pilots had individual orders. They didn't travel as a group. I was traveling on individual orders. We were helping what would be the first class section of the Aquitania. The only difference being instead of a stateroom having maybe 2 beds, it had 6. They put bunk beds in. But that was over a week to Glasgow, Scotland, and then by train over to England and up to North Sea base to get theater training, theater orientation, where we also got photographed in peasants' clothes, got phony pictures for passports and documents that we carried with us in case we were down, and the locals could.
I didn't realize they did that.
Yeah. They took pictures of us as peasants,
Wow.
so they could have the photographs, and we carried them in our escape kits that were on. It had the knee of our flying suit. And
I've heard a little bit about that from bomber crewmen, but I didn't realize. You told me something else I knew I didn't know.
well, in that escape kit, you had some morphine syrettes, and you had French money, mostly French, Belgian, and Dutch money. I don't know if there's any German money. But at that point in the war, they weren't concerned about Germany. They were most likely to get shot down. I guess they didn't figure they'd survive long enough to get to Germany. But so they, and then that's where I was introduced to the P-51 for the first time. And after maybe 2 weeks, a little more than 2 weeks there, we went shipped over to. We flew over to the beachhead to A1 on a C-47 transport plane.
Okay. So you never flew the P-51 on a mission?
No, because I got down to the 363rd Fighter Group at A1, and it was a very unusual thing. They dropped off. When we went over on a C-47, we had probably 25 pilots. Well, they dropped us off at various airstrips.
I gotcha.
So about 5 of us got dropped off at A1 up near St. Miraglise, and they were in tents at the airstrip there. And there wasn't much going on. They said, just take some 51s and go fly, go practice. They knew we hadn't had much P-51 time. So so we did. The four of us that had come over, and they're all classmates, had been classmates in advanced. We'd take 4 planes, go out and see what we could do, practice formation flying and acrobatics. And I remember Larry Cool was a classmate of mine, and he said he was going to be the flight leader, and I was number 3. He had a flight leader and wingman. I was number 3, and I had a wingman. And he said, we're going to do a loop in formation. So, okay, we're in trail formation. So I'm number 3, and he's going in, going up like this. And I said, Larry, I'm losing airspeed. And the plane, number 2 plane, spun out, spun out, and went down. And I thought, this is crazy. I'm pointing straight up and not much airspeed. You know? So I was able to ease it down. And I looked down, see number 4, and he was in an inverted spin. And I thought, well, that's the end of him. But we got back to A1, and he was there. He'd recovered. We hadn't seen him recover. So I said when we got back, I said, Larry, I said, well, he says, I thought it would fly in formation. I make the loop real big so you could all cut me off, which is normally in any sort of a horizontal formation, you're going to cut off the leader to stay in close to him. And I said, that's the wrong thing to do. I said, you stalled 2 of us out, and I almost stalled that one into a spin. But anyway, and so another little unusual incident. I don't know if you've heard this before, but I went down one day. I took a 51 on my own. It wasn't with my other classmates. And I went down the circle to Mount St. Michel. because I'd read a story in 5th grade about a couple of youngsters that got stranded out there because of high tide.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to go see this place, you know.
Yeah,
So I flew down there and circled Mount St. Michel. They very much like the one last summer when we were out there. And so, and then so about the next day, Larry Cool says, since we're not don't have anything to do, my sister's a nurse in Patton's Third Army, who were down near Paris about this time. They'd broken out at Saint-Lô and they were moving fast. And he said, let's fly down to Paris and we'll get some transportation, go get my sister. How he knew where his sister was, more than I know. But so we did. We just took 251s and flew down to Paris and landed at Le Bourget, I think, which runways had been bombed. So we landed in the grass, taxied up, and enlisted man ran out and says, we don't have any gas. We don't have any gas. I said, we don't need any gas. We need a Jeep. And he said, you couldn't have a Jeep if your name was Patton. He said, because by this time the gasoline was a very desirable quantity. And so, he did arrange for us. I'll arrange for your transportation down about 40 miles south of Paris. Now, how Larry Cool knew where his sister was, there's no cell phones or no telephone.
Right.
But somehow he knew what unit. He found out where that unit was. So we got down there after dark and found just out in the field was this big ward tent, about 100 cots in it, just behind the front lines. And I climbed into a vacant bed. His sister was on night duty. She was on a night shift. So I said, Larry, you go visit your sister. I'm going to sleep. So climbed into a cot and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, the nurse was shaking me on the shoulder and had a big concern she's going to give me an injection. And I said, no, I'm just a visitor. Anyway, we got the next day, his sister arranged for us to go back into Paris they were sending a truck in there for supplies or something. So we went on a weapons carrier back into Paris, and de Gaulle had marched his Free French Army in the day before and had the big ceremonial parade down in the Champs-Élysées. And the celebration was still going on a day later. I mean, the civilians in the street, they're jumping on their vehicle, hanging on the sides. There's so many people in the street you couldn't go fast, so they had an opportunity to do that.
And here you are in the middle of it.
Handing you flowers and bottles of wine, and so. But then we got transferred. We stayed in Paris overnight. Probably some military accommodation. I don't remember what. Flew back through the 51s back to A1 the next morning, and then learned that day that the P-363rd Squadron was going to be disbanded. It was going to go deactivated because that's when they found out. The story then was, well, we need more photo reconnaissance capability, so we're going to bring in F5s. Now, look, F means photograph, with cameras in the belly. And so we go out there, high-speed cameras. And we had the option of standing there and flying photo reconnaissance or doing fighter pilots. Again, Larry Cool was a leader. He's a year older than I was. I guess it gave him some status. We came overseas as fighter pilots. We want to be fighter pilots. Bravado, typical at the time. So that's when I got separated from Larry. Two of us went to the 406 fighter group down at Le Mans on P-47s, Larry, and the other two went to the 405th fighter group, which was somewhere else in France. And I never saw him again until after the war was over. But so that's how I got into flying 47s, which is a real much better airplane for ground support work, dive bombing, and it would take a lot more damage, sustain flak. Then the 51, because of the liquid coolant was ethylene glycol, and 51 it's flammable. So you get a hit and you get gas, pouring gasoline onto a flak hit, you know what's going to happen. You're going to burn. So anyway, it suited me better because I remember in England now we were flying some old beat up P-51s up there in England that they had taken out of combat service. And I remember practicing dive bombing. I didn't like the way the 51 handled dive bomb at maximum speed, full throttle, going vertical. It just didn't feel right. It just, the tactile feedback wasn't comfortable. The thing felt like you were skidding. Yeah, maybe it's because these are war-weary airplanes too.
Maybe.
But the P-47 had none of that. You could just go invert it to 10,000 feet and go down full power, everything to the firewall, and drop bombs somewhere around 1,500 feet or 1,000 feet and pull out. And never touch a trim tab. You didn't have much control over it. You're going 550 miles an hour at the maximum speed on dive. So it was a pilot's airplane. Extremely easy to fly, very honest, didn't have any bad habits. Other than the fact it was heavy, you had to carry power on a landing approach, which was new to us, you know.
Yeah.
But you had that thing would practically land itself. It was so stable.
Have you been around one anytime in recent years?
No, because there's very, very few P-51 or 47s flying.
Yeah.
D. Seversky, who was the designer of the P-47, a Russian immigrant, was on the War Department's bad side. They didn't like him at all. And the day the war ended in Europe, they canceled his production contract for the P-47Ds. He managed at that time. And I talked to a pilot that had arrived in the squadron the day I was shot down on my last mission in the middle of April. And he didn't get to fly. He was supposed to be on the mission that I was shot down. And he wasn't. But he was a football player, so the 406 Fire Group was assigned occupation duty when the war ended. They didn't come back to the United States. They stayed in Europe, along with other fighters groups. And so he told me that I don't think he inherited my airplane. When you became a flight leader, you got an airplane assigned to you. Didn't mean no one else flew it, but that was your plane. You could put your name on it and put nose art on it. I opted not to do that in any case. And so anyway, the 47 was I never got hit with a lot of flak until the last mission. I got some flak damage, incidental flak damage, just from the shrapnel, flying through shrapnel on a dive bomb pass. But that was really the first time I knew I was hit. Kaboom! In that engine, I knew I'd gotten a direct hit.
Well, tell me about some of your missions, from the time you were with the 406, right?
You were pretty much, about the time I started flying missions on a P-47, and I was in the 406 Squadron when the Falaise massacre happened. The Falaise Gap was closed, and the Germans, even in D-Day, you read German accounts from German participants of D-Day, they couldn't move. That's one reason that invasion was successful, because they had fighter cover. They had 51s and 47s over that beachhead, and the Luftwaffe never showed. And they learned very quickly. That's why the beachhead defenses couldn't be resupplied. They couldn't move, because anything that moved was going to get strafed by the Yabos, as they call them. And that's a common comment. Any German writer that's writing about the Normandy campaign, the Yabos. And so they learned not to be moving in the daytime and it was flying conditions. Now, if there's bad weather, I guess it probably could move. Yeah. And the same way with trains. So after we couldn't find any troops or armor or columns to strafe or bomb, we started picking on the trains. Our mission was to isolate the battlefield, keep the supplies from coming to the battlefield. And we had a heyday with some trains for a short time. Then they got smart. They learned that they couldn't fly in the daytime. They couldn't travel in the daytime. One mission, we had the front stabilized just east of Reims. By this time, I was down at Reims at A80, which had been a French military base. It had concrete runways. And whereas all the other strips I flew from were temporary. And we called a mission late one afternoon, and we didn't have a lot of ceiling, didn't have as much ceiling as we'd preferred, probably 5,000 feet, but you could still dive bomb from 5,000 feet. But you had less time to gain speed. You couldn't get as much speed up, of course. And we was around the junction of the Moselle River and this Rhine River, and a marshalling yard, a train yard where they had train cars. It was a mission. And we descended through the overcast into this valley, and it was late in the day, and I think they figured they weren't going to be yabos out that time of day in a weather like this. And there were trains all over that area.
Yeah,
man, we had a field day. We had more trains to strafe than we could strafe. And that's the only time that we really saw. One other time I had caught a train in motion, but then they stopped running in daytime. So then our missions evolved into the road system, cutting railroad tracks. We'd send one plane down at a time and bomb, just create a big hole in the railroad track, some damage, and we'd then go another couple miles down and send another plane down, and usually as far away from us civilization as we could, so they had to go farther to repair the tracks. And that posed a real problem because the flight leader, first one down, you want to be sure you hit the railroad tracks. That's a pretty small target for, 10 feet wide at the most or less. And so that, but I think one of the most interesting missions, we were flying from A80 in Reims, and the 101st Airborne Division was out of the line. They were in Reims at A80. It had been a French base. And they had a theater, which the fighter group didn't have enough people to have a theater. So we'd go down to their theater to watch a movie. And this night in December, Buddy and I had gone down to, I shouldn't say Buddy because you didn't have Buddy, so another pilot and I went down to watch a movie. Came out about 11 o'clock, and they had all these 6x6 trucks lined up on the street. They were loading these infantry guys in these trucks. I thought to myself, that's just why they're going on maneuvers at this time. Why are they moving them at this hour? Got in the ready room the next morning, and had a whole wall was a map, and you had the bomb line, had a red ribbon that told you where the American troops were, so you didn't bomb and strafe your own people. And sure enough, there was a red circle around Bastogne. They were cut off. Those guys just got up there in time. They sent 2 regiments, 101st Airborne, up to Bastogne that night. They just got up there in time for the Germans to cut them off. Because by 10 o'clock in the morning, they were surrounded. So our group was assigned the task of providing air cover for Bastogne. It was troops at Bastogne. And the skies didn't clear for maybe 3 days before we could get into the air because the weather was terrible. And when it did clear, the first mission into Bastogne was a resupply mission. The Army got busy and knew these people were going to need supply. After all, they couldn't carry much artillery or ammunition into Bastogne on such a short period. So our mission was to go up there in the snow covered. Snow was on the ground. We arrived about 8 o'clock, and had an forward air controller in Bastogne who was a pilot, fighter pilot, or ourselves. and he called out the targets, and he said, see this road, east-west road, here's a north-south road, and that quadrant, this southwest quadrant of trees, that's where the Germans are. We want you to hit them. So we'd go down, we just bombed the trees. We just couldn't see what we were hitting. They're all dug in, and they would strafe, and we had rockets by this time, high-velocity aircraft rockets. We had to sit, although we were just firing them at trees because you couldn't see anything in the tree. But he said, you should see what's happening down there. He said he could see with his field glasses what was going on. He said, you should see what's going on down there. They're really getting hammered. But then we pulled up, it lasted about 15 minutes. We pulled up, you flew 12 plane missions, 12 airplanes, 3 flights of 4. And because the C-47s were coming in much lower than we were. We're up above the light flak range, about 5,000 feet. They were probably no more than 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
And they started pushing these chutes out in the snow, landing outside of Bastogne, a good half mile from the town. I thought, well, that's pretty stupid. They're right between the Germans and America. Germans could go out and get those supplies as well as Americans. And after about the first wave of C-47s had circled around and gone back, and it just looked like a bunch of ants coming out of this ground. They're just all these black things, and their troops were down there dug in foxholes.
Shaking their snow off.
They were out dragging these parachutes into Bastogne. And then we got relieved by another planes of one of the other squadrons of the 406. We were on targets an hour, and then one would come and we would get relieved. And we flew top cover then for Bastogne for a week till Patton. In fact, we even after Patton had arrived with his tanks 4 or 5 days after the weather cleared, we flew missions up there even then because they still needed air support. The tanks needed air support. We lost. That was a very difficult week. That final mission in the Bastogne that we flew as air cover, we could only get 4 planes from each of the 3 squadrons to make a 12-plane mission. Then we'd suffered so much damage to the airplanes. And the German flak gunners, I don't know if the flak gunners were more intense, or whether the pilots were taking less cautious because of the desperate nature of the people in Bastogne. But anyway, we lost, I don't know, 406 group, how many lost? Our squadron lost 3 pilots that week, that 5 days. So, and if each of the squadrons, the 3 squadrons had the similar results, there was a lot of pilots didn't make it after that. And so then I flew one mission on New Year's Day, 1945.
Yeah.
And was gone. We were up at a target assigned up northeast of Aachen, which was the first German city captured by the Allies. And Aachen had been, I knew Aachen had been the site of the Holy Roman Empire. That was the headquarters of the Holy Roman Empire. All the, what were they called? The head honchos, that's where they lived. So I was coming back from a mission, and it was a hazy afternoon. Even midwinter, it's not that bright. It was an overcast day, high overcast. And I'm just looking over, I'm watching, I'm a flight leader, and I'm just looking down there to look at the buildings and this city on a hill. And someone's hollered, got on the radio and said, there's a dogfight going on south of us. And you could see dogfight going on. So we put on the power, went racing down there, and there were P-38s were being engaged by Luftwaffe. And before we got there, I think there were 4 or 5 P-38s, at least 4, and they all were spinning down. And we got there and there wasn't a plane in the sky, which is a typical dogfight. It could be a lot of airplanes, and all of a sudden there's none. They disappear. They'd get down low or something. So that was But that was the day that the Luftwaffe decided to put on a real push to neutralize the Yabos. So they sent all the planes they could to attack the air bases. And our base at A80 in Rhine was attacked that day. They didn't do any damage. I don't think we even damaged one airplane. I think the flak gunners shot them down. And I was gone. We were on the mission. I'm not aware we even had any damage from that. But the Luftwaffe lost like 200 airplanes that day. That was really the end of the Luftwaffe as far as any real opposition to the air war. So, and then I got back from that mission. It was January 1, and myself and two other pilots from the 513 Squadron were sent to England for rest leave. And, of course, we didn't have any airplanes anyway. It was a good time to go.
Did you fly your plane back, or
No,
like
they took the C-47, the C-47 cargo plane, landed in London, and I knew where Dan King was. By this time he was in 8th Air Force, and I took a train up to his base, fighter base. And again, I really don't know how I knew that, but I did. And spent an afternoon with him and got back in a train and joined my mates to take the train up to Liverpool, the Blackpool, which is a summer resort. And of course, this is January, so weather was terrible. And that's where I learned to play bridge. I was there a week and nothing else to do, so some guys were learning to play bridge. And it was really too nasty to be outside. We just stayed in this beautiful resort hotel for a week, eating and recovering. Took the train back to London, and London was zeroed in, and we couldn't do any transport to get back to Beachhead, back over to Paris. And we'd been there a week or so, and every day we'd go down to the transportation office and see if we'd fly us back to our base. And I noticed in the Stars and Stripes magazine that the boat service from London to Paris was going to be resumed the next day. So I rushed down. We went down to the transportation office and said, "Can you get us on this boat train to Paris?" "Okay, sure." So the three of us got on that train, left London early in the morning, and get the train down to Dover and get on a boat and go across the channel and get a train to Paris. And we got a streetcar from Paris out to Reims. We got back, and some of the non-coms operations people said, "Well, where you guys been?" I said, "Well, we got weathered in Paris. We explained we got back as soon as we could, as soon as I saw this boat train." He said, "We're going to report you all three missing in action." And that day, now, whether that was true or not, I don't know. But be likely, if you don't show up there, then you're missing. So anyway, that's good. Then within a day or so, weather was lousy, they weren't flying. They transferred the 406 Fighter Group from 3rd Army support up to the 1st Army, up in Belgium, and went up to outside of Maastricht not A, they weren't A, they called them something else, 85, outside of Maastricht. This Ron Stassen, that was my roommate in Normandy, lives in Maastricht, or just outside Maastricht. He's in Belgium, but he's just outside Maastricht, Holland. And he sent me a picture of the monument around where that site of that field was after I got back. And then we started supporting the First Army, the Allied Army was across the Rhine and across Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. And one of the notable missions on that, when they got up to the Rhine, the front stabilized along the Rhine, and then the date was set in middle of April to cross the Rhine River. No, middle of March. And so our squadron, the 513 Squadron, was assigned the task of of taking out the flak positions on the east side of the Rhine River at Wesel. That's where the landing was going to be. And they dropped 2.5 divisions of paratroopers that day. It was the largest airborne operation of the war. So our mission was, we got up there early in the morning, and when we saw the transports were coming with the paratroopers, we went down and we had targets, photographs of flight flak positions, and we just picked one out. We were using white phosphorus bombs for the only mission we had. Now, white phosphorus bomb, when it hits, it just sends out tentacles like an octopus in many all omnidirections. And the idea was to drive all these flak gunners into their foxholes.
Okay. Yeah.
So we went down and came up the first pass, the bomb pass, and came down for the strafing pass. I come up the strafing pass, and a paratrooper went right over my wing, descending. I didn't see him. He went right over the wing. I thought, this is crazy. I mean, we got all these paratroopers, gliders, crashing, C-47s on fire. I mean, it was like Dante's Inferno. And flak, and it was just a nightmare. And so I pulled up. I didn't have my wingman. There were other P-47s up out of the light flak range, and well, nothing more you could do. So came back home. I lost my wingman on that trip, and we lost our squadron commander on that mission. And he was killed. And so it was a pretty intense mission. But what looked like a disaster, because these C-47s were on fire, trying to get back to the west side of the Rhine River, and burning, and gliders crashing, and it just looked like a disaster area. But it was very successful, because they got tanks across that river, and that day, that afternoon, they got an armored division across that river, and got all the pontoon bridges ready and so forth.